In 1859, Charles Darwin published this book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. It's a book that forever changed our understanding of the biological world. Darwin makes two major claims in the book. Number one, that species did in fact change. And he has several chapters that present the evidence for species change. In addition, the book makes the case that species change by a process he calls natural selection. But we're going to focus on the evidence for species change. Why was he convinced that species really did change? There are several categories of evidence, and in this lesson we'll look at the first category. We'll call it Exhibit A, the fossil record. Darwin argues that the fossil record, as it was understood to him back then, is consistent with this idea that species changed over time, and it actually weakened the Christian view that species were fixed and unchanging. Now, the fossil record in Darwin's time was not as good as it is today. So we're going to be using a modern example to illustrate sort of Darwin's thinking and sort of to better understand how fossils could bear on the question of species change. We'll consider the vertebrate fossil history, and you're probably familiar with the 5 categories of vertebrates. We have fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds, and they're vertebrates because they have backbones. Now, someplace like the Grand Canyon is a great place to go fossil hunting. It's made of sedimentary rock layers that were deposited over time and eroded by the Colorado River. Sedimentary rocks are formed from layers of sediments that have hardened into rock. And because more recent sediments are deposited on top of pre-existing sediments, deep rock layers are older than shallow rock layers. And this principle gives us a measure of relative time. Fossils in deeper layers are older than fossils in shallow layers. Now, to measure absolute time, scientists must use radioactive dating techniques, but we're just going to look at the pattern of vertebrates found in these layers of sedimentary rock. So how are vertebrate fossils arranged in the rocks? Well, when you're examining the fossils in the upper layers, so these would be more recent rocks, we find representatives of all 5 major classes of vertebrates: fish, amphibian, reptiles, mammals, and birds. But now what happens when we examine the fossils in the next layer below that upper layer? What we find here are fish, amphibian, reptiles, and mammals, but the birds have disappeared. We don't find bird fossils. What about if we examine the fossil layers, the fossils in the layers below that layer? We find fish, amphibians, and reptiles, but now the mammals have disappeared and no birds. And what about below that? We find fish and amphibians. Now the reptiles have disappeared, and again the mammals are not there and the birds are not there. And if we go even lower, we have only fish. So the amphibians dropped out. So we have a situation then, if you get low enough down here, these rocks are some 500 million years old, you only have fish. So at some point in the distant past, 500 million years ago, the only vertebrates on Earth were fish. This leads us to a radical conclusion that all the vertebrates we see today can trace their ancestry back to fish. So apparently, in the span of 500 million years, new kinds of species emerged, new kinds of vertebrates. There were only fish 500 million years ago, and now we have all the other 5, the full 5 categories of vertebrates. So this then would be evidence that species did change. New species were emerging. New classes of vertebrates came into existence over time. Now, here's where we're going to see how this pattern of fossils can weaken the Christian worldview. Because notice then, the actual fossil record shows that new classes of vertebrates coming into existence. Now let's compare that to the prediction from the special creation hypothesis. If God really had made all the different kinds of species at some point in the past, and they had never changed, then we would predict that all of the 5 classes of vertebrates would be found in all the rock layers. They were all made at the same time in the past. And so we should find representative fossils in all of these rock layers of different ages. But we don't see that. We see this pattern over here. So this is an example of how the fossil record supports the idea of species change and weakens the Christian idea. So Darwin argued that new species emerged from pre-existing species, and in this case then the idea is that some fish evolved into amphibians, and then some amphibians evolved into reptiles, and some reptiles evolved into mammals and birds. Now, of course, some fish stayed fish. In fact, most fish stayed fish. This is why we have fish today. But all you need for in Darwin's view of the world is for some fish to undergo a change into a new kind of vertebrate. Now, this idea that new classes of vertebrates came into existence, it makes a very, very important prediction. If some dinosaurs evolved into birds, there should be fossilized transitional species that have characteristics of dinosaurs and birds. And so today, biologists argue that some of the earliest reptiles evolved into dinosaurs, and it was some dinosaurs that evolved into birds. Well, if some dinosaurs evolved into birds, then we should see in the fossil record some intermediate sorts of species, some creatures that had a mix of characteristics, some dinosaur characteristics and some bird characteristics. And we call these transitional species. Now, the existence of transitional species is predicted by Darwin's evolutionary theory. So a failure to find them would weaken Darwin's theory. Again, the Christian view would not make a prediction of transitional species because for the Christians, God made all the species and they never changed. But for Darwin, if dinosaurs evolved into birds, then we should find some transitional species in the fossil record. As it happens, in the late 1800s, at various quarries around Europe, naturalists made exactly this kind of discovery. This is Archaeopteryx. This is a reconstruction of what scientists think it might have looked like. But here are some actual fossils. These are photos of some fossils in a museum. This is a creature that has a mix of characteristics. It's got feathers like a bird, but a tailbone like a dinosaur. Now, modern birds don't have bones in their tails, but this is the tailbone. Here's another example of this kind of creature. Wings like a bird, teeth like a dinosaur. So this is exactly what Darwin would have predicted. If some dinosaurs evolved into birds, then the fossil record would capture some of those intermediate forms, those transitional species, and Archaeopteryx is such a creature. So this is how the fossil record then can support the idea of species change, and in fact then it weakens at the same time the Christian worldview.